So, I'm humbled and honored to be here. Emmanuel is someone I admired and liked tremendously. You see his influence here directly because the paper's going to have a big role to play for a safe store of value. We know Emmanuel had a great research agenda emphasizing safe assets, but also just kind of the way he approached economics is very influential to us, and in our limited way we try to live up to the same ideals. Okay, so today we're going to think about fiscal policy in a low interest rate environment. This is something that was kind of brought to the forefront a bit by Olivier's presidential address, but just in general, if you look at the data and kind of what Mike already mentioned, the government bonds do trade historically on average at a very low rate. And we wanted to think about what is the role of government debt in this environment and what is fiscal policy in general. Okay? So we're going to work in kind of your benchmark first year macro model, the Bewley-Huggett-Aguiar environment, where the big friction is lack of insurance for idiosyncratic risk. That's enough to get you low interest rates, even negative interest rates. We're going to have very general heterogeneity, so you'll see that on that side we can be very general. We're going to have potentially a wedge between the marginal product of capital and little r is the rate on savings or bonds. We're going to do that through markups, which is, markups has a couple of advantages. One is it's easy to work with. Two, they exist in the world. But there are other interpretations of this. I'll give you two that I think are not too far away conceptually with what we do. One is firm credit constraints, where firms would love to bring the marginal product of capital down to the opportunity cost, but can't for some financial friction. And then the other obvious one is the one Mike was talking about, convenience yield, and we're working out a little appendix on that. I think those conceptually aren't so far off from what we do. One that is, and I'm not going to have anything to say, is aggregate risk. So there'll be no risk premium here. There'll be no asset pricing, which is also a very popular literature right now, thinking about government budget sets in terms of an asset pricing approach. We're not going to have anything to say about that. We're looking for, we have a contribution, we think. We're going to try to make it as transparently as possible. It has nothing to do with aggregate risk. We think the insights are portable, but anyway, so that'll be clear, that we're not going to be able to address anything with aggregate risk. Okay, so I want to do a couple things in my time. One is I want to introduce this new welfare metric. We call it robust Pareto improvements. It's basically extension kind of a traditional Pareto improvement, but it really requires very limited knowledge about idiosyncratic preferences, idiosyncratic risks, how people trade off things. And in a nutshell, and I'll define it more formally later, it's got to make every potential agent better off in every state and time. All right, so it's a pretty high threshold for policy. Obviously, it's not one that we're advocating as the only threshold because it's a bit strict. But you'll see that there's scope for pursuing such a threshold in this model at least. And then the second thing is once we have this metric on board, how do we achieve it with limited instruments? So this is going to be a fiscal policy paper, so obviously you have to say what the government can and cannot do. We're going to try to be very minimalist in what the government can do. It can make lump sum transfers, not taxes. It's going to have linear taxes on factors and obviously government debt. So it's a pretty restrictive set of instruments. Then I would like to communicate, where the welfare improvements come from. And so there'll be better risk sharing, but it'll be a better risk sharing given the limited instruments. So we're not going to have a tax and transfer scheme. We're not going to have progressive taxation. I mean, we could build that in, but that's not what we're going to do. as you'll see, everyone feels richer in every state, so it's not like I'm taking from the rich and giving to the poor. There's no need actually for more output, although that will be useful in some circumstances, but we don't need it. It's just a better allocation of existing output. And then kind of an additional result that's perhaps more subtle is that government debt and capital are complements. Now, if you think back, you know, and I'll echo many of the points made in the classic papers by, you know, Samuelson OLG or Diamond OLG models. Think about Diamond, where debt and capital are substitutes. Here they'll be the complements in a very specific way that I'll try to show you. Okay, and then we're going to come up with some conditions about when is this robust Pareto improvement possible. So if the marginal product of capital is less than the depreciation rate, so if capital is beyond the golden rule, it's pretty straightforward to generate. And this is kind of an extension of Diamond's point. We have a bit more work to do because we have a little richer setup, but it's kind of the same at the end of the day. And we show that. But otherwise, we have this gap between, you know, we have a marginal product of capital is bigger than delta, so capital is below the golden rule. There's still scope. We need to have enough government revenues to weekly increase all factor prices. Remember, we're not making anybody worse off. And what I mean by anybody, I mean think about just somebody who just gets labor income and consumes hand to mouth, or somebody like that, or somebody who just lives off their capital income. All these have to be weekly better off. So the government needs to raise some revenue to do this. And we show that the key parameter is the elasticity of aggregate savings. So not, you know, so we're going to aggregate up households, and there will be an aggregate savings schedule, one for each period. But there'll be a clear implication that the more elastic this is, the more willing that households are to absorb assets or to hold wealth without a large increase in interest rate will be a key parameter. And this is kind of the sufficient statistic for idiosyncratic heterogeneities is aggregate savings schedule. And then, you know, in this environment, we got to be clear, there's a lot of shortcomings to this environment. Incomplete markets is obviously the most obvious one. There'll be a markup is another one. You know, we have to be clear what the rules of the game are, and we have limited instruments, so there's, you know, there's a lot of potential improvements, but we got to make sure that they're feasible given the tools that we've given the government, and that will really be the heart of the exercise. I'm going to skip the literature. Okay, so I'm going to breeze through the environment because it's going to be pretty familiar. If you've seen Aguiar, it's going to be basically Aguiar, and I'll just flag as I go through the tweaks that we make just to kind of give additional perspective on what we're doing that might be different than your plain vanilla Aguiar. All right, so on the household side, for the talk, we're going to admit population and technology growth. You know, there's going to be the homotheticity that we normally have that you can always include exogenous constant rate of growth in TFP, and the usual formulas pop out, right? Instead of R, we'll get G minus R, etc. So I'm just going to stick with this constant technological environment. There's a continuum of households. Idiosyncratic income risk, and there's two sources of risk. Z is the efficiency units of labor, like in the traditional Aguiar. Theta is, I'm going to call managerial talent, and I'll get to that in a second. That's also an endowment for individual I. Okay, so let's just look at the budget constraint. How do you, there. How did I do that? Okay. So, you know, this is a typical budget constraint. We have consumption of individual I, the savings they bring into the next period. This is the wage per efficiency unit they face. This is their endowment of efficiency units, N is the number of hours they provide. Capital pi is the aggregate profits in this economy. They'll be such if we have the markup, right? So we allow for a potential markup. And the way we model that is, as I said, there's some endowment of managerial talent for person I, and they get some claim on the aggregate profits. Okay, so it works just like labor in efficiency units. There's some talent or managerial endowment that they claim some of these profits. Okay, they're not traded, so that's something to keep in mind. Just like human capital is not traded. The return on their savings, R is the return on savings. Cap T is any kind of transfer, lump sum transfer the government gives. And then there's a borrowing constraint. Preferences can be very general with one restriction that we make for tractability, and that's that labor is supplied without wealth effects. Okay, so that's something that we use, and you'll see very clearly how we use it. But other than that, we don't really care so much about what the preferences look like. They can vary across individuals. We can allow for general recursive utility, Epstein-Zinn. We can nest different cohorts. We can have people only have utility in certain times. You'll see that because we work through budget sets, the preferences really don't matter. As long as more is better, we're okay. Firms, completely standard other than potentially the markup, which might not be in this traditional Aguiar. There's a representative firm, constant returns to scale technology. The taxes without loss, as usual, we can levy on the factor payments that the firm makes. So tau K is the tax on the rental rate of capital, which is RK. Tau N is the tax on labor. We get the usual first order conditions. The marginal product of capital is going to equal the inclusive of tax cost of rental rate, plus there's this wedge if there's a markup. Same with labor and the wage. Okay, and then we have aggregate pre-tax profits. Is just, if mu is strictly greater than 1, we have profits, and they get taxed at tau pi. So here you can see our taxes. They're linear taxes on the factors, capital, labor, and the profits. Oh, interrupt with questions, but so far, I assume this is pretty plain vanilla. Okay, and then the government, what does it do? It levies these taxes. It could potentially lump sum rebate surpluses. This is the tax revenue. I'm going to call it seniorage revenue because I want to think about a world in which R may be negative. So by issuing bonds, the government is actually getting resources, just in the same sense of, people would like to hold money without the government having to pay a rate of return. People want to hold these bonds and are willing to even potentially pay the government for holding the safe store of value. And then, we aggregate market clearing, asset market clearing, labor market clearing, goods market, the resource condition, and equilibrium is standard given a fiscal policy. Households optimize, firms optimize. The budget constraint holds, and markets clear. Okay, so that's the environment. Aguiar with a couple of little twists of markup and taxes and general preferences. But other than that, we're living in that world where idiosyncratic risk looms large, and people want a store of value, a safe store of value. Okay, so item 1, let's think about the welfare metric, this robust Pareto improvement. So let's go back to the household's budget constraint. And I just put in blue these aggregate equilibrium objects that show up on the right-hand side. And basically, I want to restrict relative to some reference equilibrium, right? So I'm going to call that the initial equilibrium. The government want to do some policy, and I want to make sure that everybody is on board with this policy in every state. And so I'm going to require that wages, remember this is the after-tax wages the households face. So from the household's perspective, this is what they're bringing home. Wages weekly increase. Interest rates, the return on savings weekly increase. Profits weekly increase. And then lump sum transfers weekly increase. And then if a lower bar, which is the loosest borrowing constraint in the economy, if that's strictly negative, the borrowers don't really like the higher interest rate, so I have to compensate them. Now, for a lot of the talk, I'm going to just set this equal to 0, so this term will disappear. But you know, just to keep it in mind that if there's some negative positions in assets, the interest rate, they have to make them whole as well. And then of course one strict inequality. Okay, so this is our robust Pareto improvement, and it works through the sequence, the flow budget constraint, and it's just making the right hand side of this flow budget constraint bigger. And so that's true for any z's, any thetas, any a's, with this caveat about that. At every t, this is going to make agents feel like they have more to spend. Okay, so obviously this is kind of like going to improve people welfare, regardless really of their preferences, other than the fact that I need more is better, but I don't really need to take a stand on how risk averse they are, how they trade off across states, etc. The nature of idiosyncratic risks, whether they face a lot of labor risk or little, or they only have profit income, maybe they're rentiers, the lifespans. I'm not trading off income in one state or time against another. So it requires very limited information at the micro idiosyncratic level, and that's the word robust. It's kind of like, the government really doesn't need to know a lot of the details in order to make sure that this is actually a Pareto improvement. Okay, so let's just put this in context with some of the things that you may be familiar with. It's different than the utilitarian or even the traditional Pareto metric. So there are many seminal papers in this literature that look at policy. So Aguiar and McGrattan is one. And think about Aguiar and McGrattan and the value of government bonds. You know, they can issue bonds. The government can issue a bunch of bonds at period zero, lump sum rebate those to people. Those who are constrained can consume, which is great. It relaxes their constraint. Those who aren't can save it, and then they save it against some lump sum tax in the future. It's really a way of getting around the borrowing constraint. Obviously that's an improvement. We're not allowing for that kind of scheme, okay? DeVilla and all have a very nice paper on constrained efficiency with the utilitarian metric. What they do is they think about the relative factor price between capital and wages, and you think about the poor agents, maybe they're heavily weighted their income towards wages, let's say. So then you want to tilt that relative factor price, and that improves the utilitarian metric. Again, that's not something that we're doing. Think about the traditional Social Security. You tax people while they're young, you pay them when they're old. There's a terms of trade that's better than the competitive equilibrium interest rate. You can just work through an Euler equation to show that people prefer that. Again, that's an intertemporal trade that we're not entertaining. Okay, so and then just kind of there's a lot of papers looking at Pareto improvements, improved insurance schemes, tax and transfer schemes where at some kind of ex ante period zero welfare, people like the higher insurance that the tax and transfer schemes are doing. Again, we're not doing that. So it rules out a lot of great things, but it's also very robust to the amount of information that we need in terms of preferences and risks. Okay, so now you might think, Mark, you're crazy. This is just a ridiculous kind of metric. It's never going to be possible, but so now let's go and look at what we need to make this feasible. So here's a thought experiment. Start from some initial stationary equilibrium. We can relax the stationarity, but just think it's simple. There's some factor prices, W, R, and pi, that exist in this initial equilibrium. There might be some initial debt that's financed by taxes. I'm going to assume the lump sum transfers are zero. This is also just for clean exposition. Then at t equals 0, it is normalized at time 0. The government announces a new fiscal plan. Okay. After the announcement, there's perfect foresight. Okay, so that's the experiment. I'm going to focus on a particular path to a robust Pareto improvement. I'm going to hold the after-tax wage fixed and the after-tax profits fixed. And I'm just going to focus on the role of a better return to savings, and potentially there might be some lump sum rebates. Okay, so that'll be a convenient thing, and it's also helpful just to isolate what we want to focus on. Okay, so let's think about the problem the government faces, and this is kind of a quasi-primal approach. Think about sequences of interest rates and transfers that the government wants to implement as an equilibrium. And then because of the criteria of an RPI, the interest rates have to be weekly higher, and the first interest rate is given, then it is inherited from the past, but then other than that, they can go wherever they want to go. Same with transfers. Okay, and then we're going to look for feasible. Basically, feasible means that we can implement it as an equilibrium in the government budget balances, okay, without having to resort to any lump sum taxes or lowering after-tax factor payments. And then the initial states are capital and household savings. Okay. All right, so the first step to think through is we have this new sequence of interest rates, new sequence of transfers, the households are going to reoptimize. All right, so let script A be the new sequence of aggregate household wealth. And this script A function, which maps the government's policies via the factor prices, remember I'm holding W and pi constant, into household savings, is going to be the crucial object that we're interested in. And then a closely related object is the aggregate consumption function. And closely related, I mean, it's literally related to the aggregating up the budget sets. Okay. Now, the feasible, a sequence of R&Ts that the government wants to implement is feasible if you can find a sequence of Ks and Bs such that the asset market clearing condition holds. So the households, remember the households don't really care about this stuff directly. They're facing some prices, they're gonna have some wealth. That's gotta obviously equal the stores of value, which are government bonds and capital. So that one's straightforward. The second one is a little bit more obscure, and it's basically combines the firm optimality conditions and the government budget constraint. So I'm going to walk through that a little bit. The left-hand side of this equation, the B's, is the revenue minus transfers. I mentioned this already, that the government can issue bonds. Obviously, that's going to lead to resources, but if R is negative, even without issuing bonds, there may be some resources raised through what we call seigniorage. The right-hand side is the change in net tax, the taxes on firms. So to see that, first of all, I should mention, the convenient thing about the no wealth effect on labor supply and holding W at W0 is then I know aggregate labor is going to remain at N, 0. Because the wage hasn't changed, so conditional on Z, the labor supply hasn't changed because it doesn't depend on consumption. And then you aggregate up in the usual way, you're going to get the same aggregate labor supply. So this is, we're going to just hold this fixed. This is where we're using that assumption. Otherwise, we'd have to know what the income effect on labor supply is. All right, so given that, this is what firms produce. This is what the households take home, right? They take home some labor income, some profit income, some rental rate income. This is all what they take home, and obviously the remainder is what the firm pays the government. So if you take the difference between f of kt and f of k0, these things cancel out. We get the difference in tax revenue, which is f of k0 minus f of kt, and then we have these payments on the rental rate, okay? So this is with switching signs. So this is basically the change in tax revenue, all right? So this is really what we need to know. We don't really, behind this obviously are some taxes and subsidies, but this is kind of the condition that just depends on the aggregate capital stock and the interest rate. All right. There's another one that I'm going to use, which is the same condition. And it's the same condition because of Valra's law. I'm going to talk more about that condition, give you a little more intuition, but I just want to make this statement. By Valra's law, you know, this one I derived using the government budget constraint is satisfied. The additional restriction on equilibrium was that the resource condition was satisfied. That came for free through Valra's law, but I could have done the other way. I could have said the aggregate resource condition holds. This is what the households want to consume given the sequence of interest rates and transfers. This is the resources in the economy. The resource condition has got to hold. So if this holds, we also have the conditions of a competitive equilibrium, and then the government budget constraint holds through Walras law. So I could go with either one of these, and I'll show a little bit of, we use both, depending on which is convenient. All right, so but let me talk a little bit through this condition. And the first thing I'm going to do is what we call the constant K policy, and it's useful for simplicity and transparency of what we think is kind of the heart of what's going on. So the government is going to keep capital at its initial level, and it's going to increase debt. Okay, so this feasibility condition that I just talked about, this term is going to cancel, right? The total output hasn't changed. All that's changed is RT relative to R0. And I'm going to set B0 equal to 0 as well in this. Okay, and I'm going to ignore transfers for a second. So here's what the government is raising through bond issuances. Here's that change in tax revenues. And what do I mean by the change in tax revenues? So here's the problem with this policy is the government issues debt, the interest rate goes up for the households to absorb this additional wealth. Other than if we didn't do anything else, capital would be crowded out, right? For the usual reasons. A higher interest rate will crowd out capital. Firms will demand less capital. That will lead to lower wages and profits. So what the government has to do to keep wages and profits constant is subsidize firms' capital, rental of capital, and the size of that subsidy. And you just kind of go through the simple math that the marginal product of capital, right, is going to have to equal the after-tax payments. So whatever R goes up, tau K has got to go down. It's got to be negative to subsidize firms hiring capital. And the size of the subsidy is exactly equal to the change in the interest rate. Okay, so the subsidy the government has to pay firms is exactly the change in the interest rate times the initial capital level that we're trying to keep constant. Okay, so that's where this right-hand side is coming from, and why I say it's a change in taxes. It's actually the subsidies that the government needs to pay to satisfy these conditions. Okay? So let me give you some intuition about what's going on. I'm going to go to the steady state. So in the steady state, BT plus 1 equals BT. So we're just left with minus R, which is some steady state level times B. We just have some R steady state level minus R0 times K0. And then here's the Aguiar diagram. I didn't actually tell Mike to put a diagram in, but this is what I had in mind if I had. So hopefully this will be provide all the intuition. So if you look at Aguiar, you know, we all stared at Aguiar. This is the diagram. On the vertical axis is the interest rate. On the horizontal axis are asset and capital positions. The red line is the firm's capital demand. So we have a marginal product of capital is negative related to the rental rate, which is R plus delta. We get a downward sloping line. Okay, that's the demand for capital. And then the A over Y are the household's savings. As the interest rate increases, they're going to be happy to hold more wealth. And this is this upward sloping line. Here I've drawn it, and this is a simulation we do at the end of the paper. We have a calibration, but it doesn't really, the numbers don't really matter here, but just keep in mind I've drawn it so that the initial equilibrium where these two intersect, say we start from laissez-faire, we're at some initial equilibrium, the interest rate is negative, okay? Because that's the kind of world that we want to analyze. So we're at this initial equilibrium. The government issues some additional debt and raises the interest rate. We've jumped to the steady state. The left-hand side, the seigniorage revenue is this gray rectangle. It's just the amount of additional bonds times the interest rate, right? The absolute value of that. That's the revenue they get from seigniorage. This is the cost. I've already explained that they have to subsidize capital. Remember, capital is going to stay at K0. This is the cost of that subsidy. It's this red horizontal rectangle, the change in R times K0. So this condition boils down to this gray rectangle being larger than the red rectangle. Now, immediately from this picture, we can see the importance of the elasticity of this A function. The flatter this thing is, the more that we can raise seniors revenue without having to have a big subsidy to capital taxes. And that's the key trade-off. Okay, so already we can see that this elasticity is the crucial ingredient. Notice that with the constant K, I didn't have to say anything about the shape of this function, the curvature of the production function. Other than, once given this initial equilibrium, all I'm really interested in is on the household side, how elastic are they? Right? And the more they issue bonds, this gray rectangle, creeps up here, and we have to trade this off. So you can immediately see the importance of the elasticity. Second, you can see that, this thing will have a maximum, the gray area will have a maximum at the peak of the debt-Laffer curve. We have to stop before that because of this tax subsidy, right? So there's this cost that's weighing against issuing debt that to achieve the RPI, we need to subsidize capital so it doesn't move, okay? So that's the other thing to see from this diagram. The third thing that's kind of subtle, is I think kind of interesting, but hopefully once I explain it, it's kind of familiar, is that capital hasn't changed, labor hasn't changed, total output hasn't changed. There's the same amount of stuff in this economy. Yet every agent has a bigger budget set. Every agent feels that every instant they could consume more, okay? So how is that possible? Well, it's exactly the flip side of this aggregate savings schedule. We need to convince, through the higher interest rate, enough people to delay consumption. Even though they could, feasibly, in partial equilibrium, consume more, we got to convince enough of these households to delay consumption by the higher interest rate. And then there are households who bring in more assets, get hit with a negative shock. They can consume more because they have this additional assets. So we're basically generating a cross-sectional distribution of consumption that transfers consumption from the rich, the high Z endowment people, let's say, to the low Z endowments. So we're improving the insurance in this economy, but there's no one who feels like they've given anything up. They voluntarily do this. So for me, this had a very strong echo, and it's a direct, the paper that I'm going to mention is a direct antecedent of this. It's Samuelson's OLG model. Same with the money. It's the social contrivance is what he calls it. That's an endowment economy. There's a fixed amount of chocolates in that economy. But you get a better allocation because the young are willing to take paper rather than consume their chocolates, and they're happy to give the chocolate to the old guys. That's exactly kind of what's going on here in a cross-sectional way, not in an intergenerational way, in a cross-sectional way. There's these government bonds that people are willing to hold in certain states and give, and trade them with other people. So the number of chocolates is fixed, but they're going to the people who really have the high marginal utility consumption. So we improve the allocation, right? Through voluntary trades, I think Samuelson called social coercion, like a social security system, social coercion. We don't have a social coercion here. We have voluntary trades. Okay, so this is basically everything I've said. I have this line, marketing line of, this is triple robust, no need to know the micro details, no need to know production elasticities, no need to know markup. I didn't say anything about markups, whether above or below the golden rule. All right, all we need to know is the slope of this elasticity. Now granted, there's a couple loose ends. I'm looking at the steady state, right? There's a transition, obviously. And the fact that capital is constant is actually a strong restriction. Maybe we're interested in moving capital around. So let me get to that. All right, so more general policies. Suppose capital is above the golden rule, so the marginal product of capital is less than the depreciation rate. So now, crowding out capital frees resources for consumption. So we can do the usual thing, almost the usual thing like you're familiar from Diamond, is we substitute debt for capital. We keep the interest rate the same, the households have the same amount of wealth, but instead of holding it in capital, which is like a negative return asset, they hold it in government bonds. We have this additional step we need to do. We need to subsidize wages and profits. We go through the math just to show that that's always feasible. Okay, so we just extend Diamond to our different welfare metric and a little bit of a different idiosyncratic heterogeneity, all that stuff. But the idea is kind of there in Diamond, and we just extend that. So use that intuition. Now, suppose capital is below the golden rule. All right, so here we're thinking that there's a markup maybe where the marginal product of capital is actually above the depreciation rate. The interest rate, for now, let's just think about the interest rate could be positive or negative, because now we're going to have the markup maybe as an additional source of route to feasibility. Here's the thought experiment. You announce at some period tau in the future that the interest rate is going to go up by a small amount. So this is going to be a perturbation exercise. The interest rate goes up a small amount of tau. Every other period we keep it the same. Here's the sequence of elasticity. So at every t, from 0 on, or from 1 on, there's going to be a different household aggregate savings in response to the fact that for a while they anticipate the higher interest rate, and then after it they've had the higher interest rate. So this is this elasticity. Our big R0 is 1 plus little r0. This is this elasticity. Okay, so it's kind of the sequence counterpart to that steady state elasticity. Define the return to physical capital as just the marginal product of capital at the initial capital and labor minus the depreciation rate. And here we're below the golden rule, so this is going to be strictly bigger than 1. Okay, we're below the golden rule, so there's some room to play with this marginal product of capital. The sufficient condition for feasibility is to you can find a tau and compute this elasticity, the sequence of elasticities, and we discount it back, and it's bigger than 1. So let me give you a couple of slides talking about this condition. Okay, so first of all, these elasticities of aggregate savings to the interest rate extends the insight from the constant K diagram. We want these elasticities to be big. Okay, it's at least in some present value sense. We want these elasticities to be big, and for the same intuition. Okay, but now it's in the discounted sum. So we can trade off high elasticities in one period against lower elasticities in the other. And the way to think about it is the short-run elasticities will tend to be smaller than the long-run elasticities. Actually, Samuelson talks about this in Foundations, the Chatelier principles, he calls it. The short-run elasticities that typically are smaller than the long-run elasticities. Maybe, at a period by period, the short-run elasticities are too small. But here we can smooth them across time using debt or capital. Interestingly, the terms of trade across time is the marginal product of capital, not the interest rate. So the government trades with Mother Nature, another Samuelson line, at the marginal product of capital. It trades with households at the interest rate. And of course the markup is that wedge. We could think about it as a convenience yield, but we do it to a markup. So first of all, the bigger that gap, the bigger this thing is. And the discount rate is going to be the marginal product of capital, which, because we're below the golden rule, is going to be strictly bigger than 1. And that's going to be the important intertemporal terms of trade. Okay. Point 2 is more of a literature relationship, but this, if you think about what this sequence of elasticities is if you ran an impulse response to an interest rate increase and looked at the aggregate household savings in the data and then integrated that would be the statistic. And potentially it's something that we can estimate. And there's a literature in the 80s and 90s that did try to estimate the effect of, basically they went the other way, but it's just kind of an inverse argument. They wanted to understand the effect of government debt on the interest rate because they were worried about crowding out. There were identification issues with what they were doing, of course, because government, just like with money, government debt just doesn't fall exogenously. But what they did find, which is kind of interesting, was extremely elastic aggregate savings, very little crowding out. So that's kind of heartening in some sense if we take this condition to the data that perhaps is something that would be feasible. The other thing, and here's a shout out to Ludwig and company, is they have a very slick and fast technique for computing with the sequence Jacobian, but this is basically what this is. A little bit, there's a little bit of tweaks to it, but it's basically what their algorithm does. It's very fast, it's very slick, they have a very nice way to do it. So in any model, it's very easy to verify this, and using their algorithm. And then the final thing we do in the paper, and I won't go through it, but we take a calibrated Aguiar model. We take the standard estimates of idiosyncratic income processes, some measures of a markup. We compute a policy experiment of basically going from laissez-faire to 60% of debt to GDP, which is the average that we see in the long sample. And we ask, in that world, and we solve the nonlinear, the full global solution. In that world, is it feasible to do this? And the answer is yes. So there's a lot of space for this kind of policy, mainly because in the Aguiar model with the idiosyncratic risk that we calibrate to, the aggregate saving schedule is very elastic, at least in the long run. All right, so that we do. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
In your environment, can you map the interest rate elasticity into weighted average MPCs for which you might have better data?
We haven't done that. I'll tell you what we did. Well, we've looked at papers that have gone so basically what we're interested in is the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. And there are, Auclair Company and Christian Wolf have these mappings between MPCs and the IES. We haven't actually worked that out in this environment. One thing that we did do is we worked with a representative Asian example where we have the Euler equation, and it's clear that you can map it into the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, which is a primitive in that environment, and that has to be bigger than some measure of that and the markup together have to be bigger than some threshold. As you can imagine, that's exactly what we need. And then we basically have used simulations for the Aguiar model, but maybe we should go back to that. Then the final thing I should say about this transfer smoothing. Why we call it transfer smoothing? Because we could implement this sequence of RPIs. No, take the allocation of capital. This is the way to think about it. Take the allocation of capital and debt, and we could think about implementing that with lump sum taxes in some period and lump sum transfers in other periods. Obviously, the lump sum taxes violate our notion of RPI. So what this discounted sum is telling us is actually we can use something like government debt to smooth the transition. So think about building up the capital stock, and that's the policy. He's going to implement that. In the first stages, we use debt to cover those low elasticity and perhaps we have to subsidize investment. In the long run, we have a high elasticity and additional resources, perhaps from additional capital. We can use government debt to kind of trade between those periods, or capital is also being effectively used for that. And that's what we call by transfer smoothing, is we don't want a negative transfer in the period 0. We use debt to smooth that, right? So in that sense is what I referred to as capital and debt are complements. That to implement higher investment, We need to avoid lump sum taxes and to finance a subsidy to investment. Government debt is what does that. Perfect. Okay, so what did I do? I introduced this rather restrictive but robust welfare metric. I showed that the feasibility hinges on this aggregate household savings schedule. Government debt is used for two things. One is seniorage directly if R is negative, but even if R is positive and there's a markup, it's useful to smooth across periods between low elasticity and high elasticity periods. Okay.